The weapon America remembers as the answer to Germany's heaviest tanks could not punch through the front of a Tiger. Not from 300 yards, not from 30, not even with the tube almost touching the armor. The original M6 rocket could defeat roughly 76 millimeters of rolled armor under ideal conditions. Later versions pushed that toward 90, perhaps 100. A Tiger's most hittable frontal plates were already about 100 millimeters thick. Around the gun, the mantlet could be much more. The numbers do not leave room for a miracle. And yet 7 months after German engineers examined a captured American bazooka, Germany was issuing a shoulder-fired weapon that could penetrate roughly 230 millimeters of armor. It cost 70 Reichsmarks per launcher. Germany eventually produced about 315,000 of them. The usual story says Germany copied the bazooka and made it bigger. That story is neat. It is also backward. By the time the first American launcher reached a German test range, Germany had already solved the most difficult part of the problem. What it lacked was not the warhead. It lacked the pipe. To understand why, start with the Tiger itself. The front of a Tiger was not one uniform wall. It was a puzzle of plates, angles, openings, and overlapping protection. Some areas were around 100 millimeters and nearly vertical. The mantlet thickened around the gun. One upper plate was thinner, but it lay back so sharply that a soldier firing from ground level had almost no practical shot at it. That created a brutal contradiction. The armor thin enough for the bazooka to threaten was the armor a man could barely hit. The armor he could hit was as thick as the rocket's entire theoretical ability. The sides and rear offered better chances. Around 80 millimeters in many places, less on parts of the lower hull. But better chance is not the same as reliable kill. A bazooka team had to get to the flank of a moving tank, stay alive, judge the angle, and fire from roughly 100 yards with a tube more than 4 feet long resting on a man's shoulder. Against a Tiger, the weapon was not useless. It was conditional. And war has a way of turning conditional weapons into legends after the conditions are forgotten. That is exactly what happened in Sicily. In July 1943, American troops fought German armor around Gela and Piazza Ridge. 17 Tigers from Schwere Panzerabteilung 504 took part in the counterattacks. 10 were lost in the first days. Years later, those losses were often folded into a simple heroic sentence. An American paratrooper destroyed a Tiger with a bazooka. The surviving picture is far less clean. American naval gunfire from cruisers and destroyers broke up the German attacks. Heavy shells tore apart supporting infantry, shook formations, damaged vehicles, and forced withdrawals. At Piazza Ridge, a captured 75mm pack howitzer was fired over open sights. American Shermans joined the fight. Naval guns kept landing around the German advance. The Tigers were not stopped by one magic tube. They were stopped by a battlefield. The most famous bazooka kill was credited to Private Robert Stevens. Ordnance observers reportedly treated it as an extraordinary shot through the driver's vision opening. Through an opening, not through the armor around it. That distinction is the entire story. A rocket entering a slit does not prove the rocket can defeat the plate. It proves the plate is why the shooter needed the slit. James Gavin, who commanded the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment in Sicily, later described the bazooka in language stripped of legend. At point-blank range, he wrote, rockets bounced harmlessly from the tanks. The troops learned the weapon's limits in combat before the Army formally admitted them. But the American bazooka still contained a revolutionary idea. And that idea was more valuable than the first rocket built to use it. The launcher came out of work led by Lieutenant Edward Uhl and Colonel Leslie Skinner. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in May 1942, the concept was demonstrated before senior ordnance officers. The famous origin story says Uhl saw a length of pipe in a scrap pile and realized the anti-tank rocket could be fired from it. The pipe is documented. The flash of inspiration comes from Uhl's own later memory, and memory often polishes rough development into one perfect moment. But whether the idea arrived in a second or over weeks, the result was real. A soldier could now carry an anti-tank weapon on his shoulder. No towed carriage, no recoil mechanism. No need to crawl up to the tank with a mine or satchel charge. The rocket motor burned out inside the launch tube. The rear of the tube vented the blast away from the firer. The launcher weighed roughly 12¾ pounds. The rocket weighed about 3½ pounds. It was light enough to move with infantry. It could be fired standing. It turned anti-tank power from a gun into something closer to a rifle. That was the American breakthrough. But while the United States was solving portability, Germany was solving a different half of the same equation. By the autumn of 1942, months before German troops captured an American bazooka in Tunisia, German engineers were already developing the Raketenwerfer 43. The troops called it the Püppchen, the little doll. Its nickname was harmless, its warhead was not. The weapon fired an 88mm shaped charge rocket capable of defeating the tanks Germany expected to meet on the Eastern Front. The cone geometry worked, the liner worked, the explosive arrangement worked, the standoff worked. Germany had already built a warhead that could punch far beyond the American 60mm rocket. The problem was everything attached to it. The Püppchen sat on wheels. It had a breech, a shield, trails, and a carriage. It was crew-served. It could be broken into loads, but once fighting began, it still behaved like a small artillery piece. It had to be towed, pushed, dragged, positioned, and protected. Germany had invented a powerful anti-tank rocket and then bolted it to the exact thing infantry needed to escape. So by the winter of 1942, the two armies held opposite halves of the answer. America had a portable tube with an undersized warhead. Germany had a powerful warhead trapped on a carriage. The halves met in Tunisia. German forces recovered intact American bazookas during the fighting around Kasserine Pass in early 1943. Captured launchers were shipped to Germany. In March, one was evaluated at Kummersdorf, the Army's test center. German engineers did not look at the American warhead and discover shape charge physics. They already had better penetration. What they discovered was proof that the whole weapon could live on a man's shoulder. The open-ended launch tube, the vented blast, the trigger, the sights, the handling. Most important, the idea that a rocket weapon of this class did not need to be a gun at all. It could be carried like one. That was the missing half. The result was the Raketen Panzerbuchse 43, quickly nicknamed the Ofenrohr, the stovepipe, and then the improved RP's B-54 known to history as the Panzerschreck. The German design took the shoulder-fired concept and enlarged it around the 88mm warhead already proven in the Püppchen. Not a copy. A marriage. A German charge inside an American-style solution to recoil and portability. The work went to Hazag, the Hugo Schneider company, at its plant in Saxony. And then came the number that matters more than the penetration figure. March 1943. The captured launcher is tested at Kummersdorf. October 5, 1943. The first production batch is issued. 1,500 launchers, 5,000 rockets, sent by air to the Eastern Front because the front would not wait for rail schedules. 7 months. From captured equipment on a test bench to an operational weapon crossing a continent. The Panzerschreck's warhead could penetrate roughly 230mm of rolled armor on a square hit. At a severe angle, that figure dropped toward 160. Published wartime tables are inconsistent about angle notation, but the physics is not. The farther the strike moves from square, the less steel the jet defeats. Even so, the leap over the bazooka was enormous. Roughly 76 to 100mm for the American rockets. Roughly 230 for the German weapon under ideal impact. Not always 3 times, but comfortably more than twice. And twice was enough to change the target from a wall into a vulnerability. The reason was brutally simple. A shaped charge does not depend mainly on projectile speed. The explosive collapses a metal liner into a narrow jet moving fast enough to force its way through armor. The size and geometry of the charge matter. The American rocket was 60mm across and weighed about 3.5 pounds. The German rocket was 88mm across and weighed roughly 7.25. The larger cone formed a larger, more capable jet. Germany did not gain 230mm by copying a 60mm tube more carefully. It gained it by refusing to stay inside the 60mm limit. Set that against the Tiger and the reversal is complete. The American launcher introduced the concept, but could not reliably defeat the Tiger from the front. The German weapon, built from the same portable launch principle, could threaten the frontal armor of the Tiger, the Panther, and nearly every Allied or Soviet tank it was likely to meet. Then came the economics. A Panzerschreck launcher cost about 70 Reichsmarks. The commonly cited build cost of a Tiger was roughly 250,800 Reichsmarks. A fully equipped fighting vehicle could be higher. Using the conservative comparison, the price of one Tiger equaled the price of more than 3,500 Panzerschreck launchers. Not 350. 3,500. That does not mean Germany could trade launchers for tanks 1-to-1. A launcher needed rockets, trained men, transport, ammunition supply, and a firing position. Most shots missed, failed, or never happened. But the comparison reveals what shaped charges did to the economics of armored war. The cost of building a tank remained enormous. The cost of threatening one collapsed. The launcher price is documented. The cost of an individual rocket is not clearly preserved, and any precise cost per kill would be invention. It is also unnecessary. 70 against 250,000 already tells the story. Production followed the same logic. The early RP's B-43 appeared in only a few thousand examples before the improved RP's B-54 took over. The later shortened RP's B-54-1 added tens of thousands more. The surviving totals do not align perfectly. Some records give roughly 314,900 delivered. Summing variant figures produces a number a few thousand higher. The honest total is not an exact digit. It is approximately 315,000 launchers. The factories did not switch from one model to the next like a light turning off. Early and improved versions overlapped for months, while production priorities changed under pressure. That overlap matters because it shows what wartime manufacturing actually looks like. Not a clean handoff, a crowded line trying to produce the old answer while the new answer is already being demanded. In 1943, production reached more than 50,000. In 1944, it surged above 238,000. And in the collapsing months of 1945, factories still delivered more than 25,000. The weapon was being issued until the system issuing it ceased to exist. But penetration, price, and production can make the Panzerschreck sound more perfect than it was. It was not Germany's true mass anti-tank weapon. That title belonged to the Panzerfaust. The Panzerfaust cost about 20 Reichsmarks. It was simple, disposable, and issued in enormous numbers. A soldier fired it once and threw the tube away. The Panzerschreck cost more, weighed more, needed a separate rocket supply, and normally required a trained two-man team. German wartime claims from early 1944 credited the Panzerfaust with several times more Soviet tank losses than the Panzerschreck. Those figures are incomplete and should not be treated as a precise ledger, but the direction is believable. The cheap weapon did more work because the cheap weapon could be everywhere. So why keep the Panzerschreck? Range. The early Panzerfaust was a weapon of terrifying intimacy, 30 meters, 60 meters. Later versions stretched farther, but practical engagement often remained brutally close. At 50 yards, a man was not merely firing at a tank. He was waiting for the tank to arrive in his room. The Panzerschreck gave a trained team a chance to fire at roughly 150 yards or more, then move before the tank reached the position. That difference was enough to justify both weapons. The Panzerfaust was quantity at contact distance. The Panzerschreck was repeatable fire for crews who needed more reach and more certainty. That certainty came with a cost. The launcher weighed roughly 20 to 24 pounds depending on the model and shield. The tube was nearly 5.5 feet long. The rocket motor continued burning after the projectile left the muzzle. That gave the heavier rocket the thrust it needed. It also produced a violent plume of smoke and burning powder. Every shot pointed back at the crew. German doctrine warned teams to fire and relocate, using staggered positions rather than launching twice from the same place. The backblast was dangerous enough that early crews improvised protection with gas masks, ponchos, and gloves. The official blast shield that gives the later weapon its unmistakable silhouette was not approved until February 1944. The men at the front solved the problem before the factory did, and the weapon was not naturally accurate. One reported test put only 3 of 12 rounds into a stationary T-34 at roughly 110 yards. The conditions, crew experience, and test method are poorly documented, so the figure cannot carry too much weight, but it supports the larger truth. The Panzerschreck could penetrate almost anything. That did not mean it could easily hit anything. Aiming, range judgment, smoke, fear, moving targets, and return fire still existed. The weapon solved armor. It did not solve combat. In ruined cities, the balance shifted again. Streets shortened every distance. Windows, cellars, rubble piles, and alley corners turned the Panzerfaust's weakness into an advantage. A tank in a city could rarely stay far from a hidden shooter. In that world, the disposable weapon became dominant. The Panzerschreck remained the specialist tool. Heavier, rarer, more demanding, but capable of engaging farther out and striking with extraordinary penetration. That is why the honest verdict is not best anti-tank weapon of the war. It is more specific. The Panzerschreck was the weapon for the crew that could not afford to wonder whether the warhead was large enough. And its influence did not end with Germany. The United States improved the original Bazooka through the M9 and M9A1, but it remained trapped by the 60mm diameter. The real correction came after the war with the M20 Super Bazooka, 3.5 inches, about 89 millimeters, almost the same diameter class as the German weapon. America had invented the shoulder-fired concept. Germany demonstrated the price of making the warhead large enough for modern armor. Then America adopted that correction. The Soviet Union drew from all of them: the Panzerfaust, the Panzerschreck, the Bazooka. Post-war weapons such as the RPG-2 and later RPG-7 inherited the same basic philosophy: A shape-charge warhead sized for the target, launched from a recoilless tube light enough to move with infantry. The details changed, the principle survived, and that brings the story back to the sequence. Germany did not capture a bazooka, discover shaped charges, and copy the whole weapon. Germany already had the penetrating warhead. America already had the portable tube. Tunisia was simply where those two incomplete answers met. 7 months later, the combined idea was on the Eastern Front. Roughly 315,000 launchers followed, 70 Reichsmarks each, 230 millimeters of penetration. All built around a lesson the first bazooka had already proven, even when its rocket failed against the Tiger. America built the pipe. Germany built the charge. The Panzerschreck was what happened when the two halves finally found each other.